Yeah, can you hear me okay? Okay. Thanks for that, John. No pressure then. Actually, it's funny. I was thinking back to the Safe Uncertainty paper, which came out in 1993, and during the following year, I did quite a lot of teaching on it, and I was in another place teaching on a master's program, and I started off, talking about safe uncertainty, and after about half an hour, this guy at the front said, "You know this safe uncertainty idea?" "Yes." He said, "It's rubbish." And I involuntarily looked at my watch and thought, a day to go. And so I smiled and I said, remembering what David Campbell used to say, that all feedback is useful, and I said, well, look, it's okay. I don't expect you to just automatically like it. But, this is a master's program, so it'd be far better if you said, it's rubbish because. So anyway, hopefully it's a bit better today. So first of all, I'd like to thank you very much. As John said, we were really pleased to be invited. It's a fantastic development, and to be part of the opening is really an honour. It's an exciting development, and I wish you well. In this presentation, I want to talk about the idea of how the framework of safe uncertainty came into being. I want to talk about developments, in particular some associated concepts which now make up the framework. I want to look at what each quadrant in the framework comprises, and I want to look at what safe uncertainty isn't. I also want to talk about how I work per se in using systemic ideas, and because safe certainty doesn't exist in a vacuum, it relates to how I think about theory, how theory is put into practice, and it includes how I think about the self of the clinician. All of the ideas I will talk about apply to us, not just clients whom we serve. In discussing all of these issues, I will show a couple of transcripts from 2 first sessions, one with a couple and one with a family. I should say that my work, I have a specialism really in working with chronic pain and chronic relationships, and chronic illness. And so I will, the examples come from that area. But I think also, obviously I'm biased, but I think even in working with families where older people and younger people for that matter don't have a chronic illness, people usually have experience of illness in relational terms. So there's the person with the condition may have the illness, but also other people, significant others, have relationships with that. I'll give you the second example. The third example is a piece of family work. They hopefully illustrate how I take what I call relational risks in encouraging those with whom I'm working to themselves take relational risks. I also want to say at the outset that the ideas that I'm presenting do not take risks with the safety of children and vulnerable adults. At times, as you will know better than I, there are situations where we have to become active decision makers, which may, for example, need the removal of children to a safer place. I qualified as a social worker in 1977. Before I qualified, I'd been employed as an unqualified social worker working with homeless families. And this introduction to working with families was to set my future path in that after training I specialised in that field and have been doing so ever since. I worked at Islington Family Service Unit for 7 years, working with families who needed intensive input. It was here that I started to become interested in systemic ideas and how they could be applied to social work practice, usually working with families in their homes, but also at times the families coming to the unit. As I became more experienced, I started to feel more confident in helping people explore difficult issues, the previously unsaid, constantly calibrating and recalibrating the balance between risk-taking that might contribute to families and individuals moving forward to a safer place in their relationships, and playing more safe with families, because introducing too much difference, introducing risk-taking into the work could possibly contribute to people feeling less safe. As you will be aware, we're always making clinical judgments in the moment. Frameworks, guidelines, checklists can help us, but they don't do the work for us. In terms of moving towards positions of safe uncertainty, I came to realise that for a lot of the time that we were dealing with uncertainty and unpredictability. For 5 years after working in FSU, I was the principal of the Rownham Centre for Families and Children in Enfield, a part of social services. part of social services. We worked with adolescents and their families. I did that for 5 years. Most of them on a non-residential basis, but we also had a residential unit next door as part of the centre. In the residential unit, and we used systemic ideas in both, and in the residential unit, we developed a new way of doing handovers, which became a book. However, there's always a downside. John was talking about, in a way, it was a move forward, but for some people it was a move backward. We became very successful at keeping young people out of care, which had been the reason why the centre was set up, and young people were moved out of the borough quite a long way away at times, so it was spending a lot of money. So the development in practice, in systemic practice in particular, actually had the advantage of saving money. However, a couple of counsellors became aware of the fact that in being so successful, we had low occupancy in the residential unit. I was in a battle at times, supported, I have to say, by an excellent line manager, to convince them that overall we were saving the council money, but it was a struggle. Towards the end of this work, I had started to form the ideas that led to the Safe Uncertainty Framework, although it wasn't until 1991 that I actually used the terminology that led to the quadrant, which I'll show soon. But before I go on to that, I just want to say something also about general principles that I use and ideas that I use as part of this work, because, as I say, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Now, John mentioned it, but when, and it's a principle I have in terms of how do we talk about our work in a way that's accessible, that we're dealing with complex issues, but how do we deal with it in an accessible way? And partly it comes from way back, that when I first got into systemic work, ideas, and started training in 1980, one of the things that happened was that, I was reading articles, there were new ideas, different language, and I subscribed to one of the main journals, an American journal, and I would be reading the articles in this journal, and I'd get to the end of the first page, and I'd have to go back to the beginning. You experienced that, have you? And you know, and I knew on one hand it was a new language, it was jargon, but there's useful jargon and not so useful jargon, or jargon that's used in a useful way, and jargon that's used in a non-constructive way. And anyway, it got so bad that at the end of the year I didn't resubscribe, because by that time I was feeling rather thick. Anyway, I did say to myself that if I ever wrote anything, I hadn't written anything at that stage, I would try to write in a way that was readable. And for other people to judge, but that's what I tried to do. And I'm hoping that this presentation is consistent with the notion of accessible complexity. I think, you know, in terms of thinking about safe uncertainty and taking risks, it's about going beyond what we think we're capable of, and helping families go beyond at times, not pushing them, you know, to the extent that it's not helpful, but having a belief that people can go beyond what they think they are capable of. And a few years ago, I was in Poland, and I went to Auschwitz, and I was reading The Trial of God by Elie Wiesel. And Elie Wiesel was a child in Auschwitz, and he remembers adults putting God on trial, as to say, well, where is God? You know, why have we got to this place, and where is he? And later, when he grew up, he wrote a book, The Trial of God, and it was about a program that had happened. It was set a couple of centuries earlier, and in it, after the program, a while afterwards, there's a conversation in the inn, and with Berish, the innkeeper, and some other people. And Berish then makes a speech. He says, "Do you have the courage to go to the end of things and utter words no one has ever uttered before, and ask questions no one has dared ask before, and give answers no one has ever had the courage to articulate before?" And I think it made a big impression on me in terms of when we're working with people who, in often very difficult circumstances, what part do we play in this? And you know, expecting clients to take particular risks is important. But also, as John has talked about self-reflexivity, we also have to think about what's happening with us. Indeed, was I showing a blank there? No, come up a blank. Indeed, you know, in the paper that John contributed, or the mainstay of, and Alison, his wife, and others, talk about social graces, and that it assists practitioners to be mindful about a range of differences and generating a desire to extend their practice beyond their current ability. So it's of the same order. What are we doing to sort of move, to take risks? A favourite photographer of mine, Diane Arbus, who some of you might know, and she talks about she says, one of my favourite things is to go where I've never been. And I think in terms of clinical practice, it's to hold that in mind. And she also says, take pictures of what you fear. And that sort of leads to, you know, us asking questions, well, what's going on with us, and what do we have to hold in mind? And one of the things that I always try to hold in mind, both as a clinician and as a supervisor, is to always be asking the question, what issues, themes, feelings might I be pulling back from addressing? And that's at the level of self-observation. And then the other part is, how do you explain why this process of pulling back from addressing is occurring? And you'll see an example of this in one of the clinical examples. Okay. I just want to say something also about a word about language. One of the things that I know John and I learned very early in our interest in systemic work was influenced by the Milan team, who were influenced by Bateson. Beware of the overuse of the verb to be. And it's very easy, isn't it? We're all human. Someone will say, well, he, she is difficult. And the idea was to change it, to say, I find him difficult. And once you've said, I find him difficult, you've introduced a dyad, as Lynn Hoffman would say. Then you would start asking questions. Well, how come I'm finding this person difficult? What is going on with me that is contributing to my finding this person difficult? So immediately you would bring yourself into the equation. Two particular ideas about from early learning on systems theory. One of the basic ideas, which I've never forgotten and is always there, is that there are different ways of seeing, basically the same thing. So we're always working with, well, what other ways are there of seeing something that's been presented to us? And sometimes, a lot of the time this is useful. Although sometimes it isn't, because it's essentially about thinking about reframing. Reframing is one of the essentials in systemic work, as you know. But I would work with teenagers, and I remember a couple of events, a couple of sessions, where I was with a mother and a 15-year-old boy, and at one point the boy wasn't saying much. He was rather stereotypical. I'd ask him a question, he'd go, and so I learned to go with that, and I said, well, that's okay. I'd say to him, well, one of the things I've noticed in my experience is that when people don't say much, they're often good listeners. So, I'll talk with your mum, but I'll take it that you're listening quite closely, and if you want to come in at any time, yeah, that's fine. So I go to the mother, and she says, he's very stubborn. So I thought, I'll reframe this. I said, how long has he been so determined? And she said, I've never thought about it like that before. Yeah, he is quite determined. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, I had almost like the identical situation. And I said, she said he's stubborn. And I said, I'm remembering what had happened. And I said, how long has he been so determined? And there was a slight pause, which I knew something wasn't right. And she looked at me and said, he's not determined, he's bloody stubborn. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If you're going to experiment with difference, sometimes it's not going to work out. But the other thing I think about in making mistakes, as long as they're not absolutely terrible mistakes, is most of us in this room, I'm sure, if not all of us, we are in relationships where we will say the wrong thing at times, whether personally, professionally, and other people will say the wrong things to us. But I would think that our experience is we're not going to damn people just because they say the wrong thing. Most of us, I think, are in relationships where a mistake is in the context of an overall relationship which is fairly good. We can't be perfect. So I take the work often, taking risks. You get it wrong. Some comments about respect and power. Some beliefs that people hold I don't have respect for. Racism or men being above women. It would be disingenuous of me to think that I respect everybody's beliefs. I don't. And I don't respect everybody, I don't expect everybody to respect my beliefs. But we're working with difference. We're trying to find bridges across difference. And I'm interested in how people's beliefs have emerged. What are the stories about how these beliefs have emerged over time? I live in Stoke Newington in North London, and I work for quite a long time now. I've been working with the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community there, and I'm not Jewish, I'm a humanist and an atheist. But I was involved in training the first rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, he qualified as a family therapist. After a year, when he'd finished, he got in touch with me and he said, I'd like to see this man. He doesn't want to see anybody from within his own community because he's he's worried that if it'll get out, it won't be kept confidential. So, and I said to the rabbi, I said, yeah, that's okay, I'd be interested in seeing him. And he also said, one of the reasons is that when people from this community are in a room together, God can hear everything that they say. But when they're in a room with you, it's confidential, and I've had quite a lot of people say to me, from the community, it's almost like they whisper it to me. They say, I couldn't say this if I was outside. So it's also encouraging to take risks in talking about the unsaid. Now, the other thing is that, John talks about irreverence and respectful irreverence, and that's the sort of position I try to hold, because an uncritical reverence, as we all know, can contribute to the creation of a context where abuse is more likely to occur. You only have to look at, for any of you who've read the Irish courts, reports on 4 of them, on clerical rape and abuse. One of the criticisms was that people in power expected too much reverence, and people in the community were also giving too much reverence because that was the expected from those positions, people in power. And then you've got, of course, Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris, Harvey Weinstein, and all what's going on at the moment. So a respectful irreverence is important. And as people with power, all of us in this room have power, I see it as a responsibility to say to people and to give a message across, really, about how they can challenge us, because clients invest in us a constructive ownership of power, and as part of a collaborative approach, it's important for us to open ourselves up to being challenged. That is a constructive ownership of power. So I always say at the beginning of the work, look, it's very important to me in my work with you. Hopefully I want to find a fit with what you're saying, but it may be that sometimes I go along the wrong track, or I say things that just don't fit for you. It'd be very helpful to let me know or challenge. So I try to introduce in the therapeutic relationship, right from the first session, the seeds of a culture where I can be challenged. Okay, so now I want to go onto the diagram, the basic diagram around safe uncertainty. So this is the quadrant, hopefully a lot of you know, and I'm going to go through the different different quadrants and talk about each of them, and I'll end with safe uncertainty, and I'll talk about what I think are some of the elements in safe uncertainty that we need to think about in assessing safety, how much risk we can take. And the thing about unsafe certainty, I'll start there. Here in this place, life often feels chaotic, often a day-to-day existence, emotional and or physical and or financial. There's often uncertainty about and fear of the future, the loss of how you hoped things would be. There is often a loss of believing one can usefully influence events in one's life, a feeling of being overburdened with what one has to do just to stand still, never mind what is often the case, feeling that you are on a slippery slope. I've often seen people, no doubt you as well, who come in a state that the novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald called a real dark night of the soul, where it is always 3 o'clock in the morning, day after day. And, he was talking about his own mental breakdown in a series of short stories called A Crack Up. But I think it sort of very much applies to what's often happening when people come in this state of unsafe uncertainty. It's also what the writer Hannah Arendt has called an unbearable sequence of sheer happenings. It's an amazing term. An unbearable sequence of sheer happenings, where the weight of what has to be dealt with, the inevitable weariness of it, constrains one's ability to make meaning of what has happened, what is happening. In the field I specialise in, people with chronic pain, chronic illness and their significant others, you see this weariness, the certainty, the uncertainties that relate to the treatment journey, the GP visits, the hospital visits, the x-rays, the medications, the side effects of medications, the blood tests, the battles with government departments regarding benefits. And what do you want when this is happening? And understandably so, there's a logic to all of these. You want someone just to make it better. You want safe certainty. Is this, am I too close to this mic at all?
Yeah.
I am? Okay. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. You've heard what I've said. So you want safe certainty, and it's also, it's understandable, isn't it? If you when something happens to you and you don't feel very good, you just want people to make it okay. So it's not surprising at times that people who come in this place of unsafe uncertainty, they want you to tell them at times what to do. And it's not terrible. Who hasn't in this room been in a state at times where you've just wanted someone just to make it better? Is there anybody in this room who hasn't experienced that? So I think safe certainty, this desire for certainty, doesn't exist really except in our desire for it to be so. It's often to be supplied from outside oneself, like a professional. And if safe certainty existed, there would be probably far fewer problems in the world. You could just go to this place and it's all fixed. So the person in this quadrant will often want a professional, someone else, to provide the solutions to their problems. because they come from unsafe uncertainty where they feel as though they can't influence events in their lives. They've lost that. So they have a lack of agency, a lack of self-esteem, a lack of confidence that they contribute much to moving forward. Sometimes when people come like that, in terms of the journey, systemic journey, in terms of development, as John indicated, there are, in theory, we've come to a position where people have said, you mustn't be an expert. You know, the expert position is like the worst thing you can be. That's how it sort of developed. Because it was a reaction to professionals seeing people and sort of diagnosing them and saying, well, this is what's good. The thing is, there's lots of good work done on what was called the first order position, and a move towards taking into account more what people, what clients themselves thought was a development in the field. But also, as John said, sometimes people, don't want to be told, well, you're the expert in your family. I mean, at times, I'm certainly not the expert in my family, at times. And despite the fact that I, quite well qualified, I have at least one brother who certainly doesn't think I have any expertise. Sorry. And it used to be that one of the biggest sins now is being an expert and being non-collaborative. There are all these buzzwords on it, being collaborative. When I was training, the biggest sin was to be linear. I always remember in my training, in my supervision group, clinical supervision group, I said something, and there were 4 of us. And the culture, the rules in the supervision group when you're training is you don't put anybody down in your group. We're all in the same boat trying to pass. Anyway, I said something, and this other person said, "Oh, Barry, that's very linear." And, I'd been divorced 2 years, and I think I dealt with that very well. But being told I was linear, I was near to tears on the tube that night. That person got nowhere. Of course, I'm not bitter. So that's safe certainty. And it's, I say, all these positions are logical. The other thing about unsafe certainty, if I go on to that now. In here, life feels unsafe, but the person in this position tends to lean towards feeling convinced of their certainty, of the view of the solution. I was laughing at Isabel when you were talking earlier about, I know I'm right, as we all do at times. When you're in this place of unsafe certainty, there is often less curiosity of the other because you're so into your own view of things. So you're less curious of the perspective of other people and may try to convince others of the rightness of your position. That's the sort of, and you see it with couples all the time, in the first 15 minutes. If relationships are going badly, you get perhaps one, both, always trying to convince the other of the rightness of the position, saying, if only you thought like me, we wouldn't have a problem and we wouldn't have to come here. They're more likely to be stuck on a zoom lens, finding difficulty in having a wider perspective. I remember a situation in the residential unit in Enfield that I mentioned, of a father accompanying a social worker with his 13-year-old son who had been misbehaving at home, stealing from his parents, running away from home. The boy, tearful, was admitted to care. The father asked who was the most senior worker in the unit, and it happened to be me. He came up to me, and he came up very close, his face almost touching mine, and said to me quite fiercely, "Look, my son has been stealing, run away from home, he won't do what his mother or I tell him to do, I want you to fix him. Sort him out. When you've done that, we'll take him home." Am I making myself clear? Do you understand that? I remember saying to myself, just stay calm, Barry. It's nothing personal. He calmed down eventually, and we were able to have a quieter conversation for about 15 minutes. He was absolutely certain about what we should do. There seemed to be a sense of shame that he couldn't do it himself. More recently, I saw a couple who were separated about the relationship and looking after their 10-year-old daughter. And the man came in and first, and he was joined by his wife, his ex-wife, and he was absolutely furious. He didn't really want to be there. He was a reluctant client. He was convinced that his ex-wife needed to change. He had no curiosity about what was going on with her, and it was very fraught. And it was one of the few occasions where I was really worried about potential violence. And at times, as I said before, you have to step in and take action. And I said he left eventually, and I said to her, look, I'm really worried about this. You need to, I think, get in touch with a solicitor, and I'll find out places of safety in the area where you live, which I did and passed on to her. And she got some legal help and started to deal with it. Now, safe uncertainty. A position of safe uncertainty isn't a fixed position, it's always evolving. But there are things which can indicate whether someone is in this domain. In many ways, you could say this is an assessment tool, and I'm going to give you 7 elements, 7 areas where, which I think make up an assessment as to whether it's more likely to have, one is more likely to have safer relationships. Now, when confidence grows and people can experiment with difference, new patterns can emerge. For example, there's considerable evidence that parental teamwork has improved to the extent there's no longer constant arguing between the parents, and the threat of violence is no longer there. So you're looking for parental teamwork, which involves curiosity of the other and not trying to convince the other of the rightness of your position. Then I would see, when this starts to happen, I would see such people as having become a visitor to safe uncertainty. And if it sort of is maintained, that people eventually become a resident in that place. So what does safe uncertainty look like? Hold on a second. So, 1, curiosity. There's more evidence of curiosity of others in significant relationships. When relationships are going well, there tends to be a good balance, it doesn't have to be 50-50, between the showing of curiosity towards others and the giving of your thinking about some issue. When relationships are going badly, there is usually a reduction in curiosity of the other. What tends to be in the ascendancy is people trying to convince the others that, you know, just go along with me, it'll be okay. This is not just when it's an odd episode, but when it's an ongoing problem. One of the ways I try to address such a problem, lack of curiosity, is to ask family members to interview each other about an issue. It could be about an aspect of their family history. I've asked adolescents to interview their parents about what they were like as adolescents. In this exercise, they can only ask questions. They can't make statements. I just asked them to do it for 2 minutes, because actually I found that even people find that hard to ask questions for just 2 minutes. And I have a little, well, not a bell, but I bang the desk next to me. Because sometimes people say, they ask a question, but it's not a question, it's a statement. They say, when you did that, do you realise that when you did that, it was very unhelpful? It's technically a question, but it's really a statement. So if they say things like that, I bang the desk and say, no, that's not curiosity. That's a sneaky way of having a go. And in my sessions, it's not allowed. So it's like their curiosity at times has gone AWOL. So these people, the second thing is that people are open to and are able to put into practice a commitment to experimenting with difference, often just a small difference. And this is based on the following ideas about change. Okay. For useful change to happen, we sometimes need to become less certain of the positions we hold. When we become less certain of the positions we hold, we're more likely to become receptive to other possibilities, other meanings we might put to events. If we can become more open to the possible influence of other perspectives, we open up space for other views to be stated and heard. So what I'm trying to do a lot of the time is, how can I help people come off autopilot so they're open to other possibilities without trying to convince them that my views are right and their views are wrong. The second way of looking at change, which is more recent, is this, and I use it quite a lot. I always use it in the first session, and in fact over the years I've got much more transparent about some of my theoretical ideas, and I actually show this to clients and I give them it to take away. I explain it and ask them, well, if you were to experiment with some small difference that may contribute to the relationships getting better, what small difference do you think you could experiment with? And for example, I ask people to not tell me in the session. I say, look, I'd like you to go away and think about this and think of some small difference that you can perhaps experiment with. It may work, it may not. And I'd like you to email me in a couple of days and tell me what it is and what each of you decided. But you can't tell anybody else in the family what you're going to do. And next time when you come, I'll ask you, can you guess what the other tried to experiment with? So it's what Bateson would call serious play. But it's very, kids like it, young adolescents, basically what I work with. I don't tend to work with very young children. And I'll give you an example now of a piece of work with an ultra-Orthodox Jewish man, his names have been anonymized. His name is Chaim, and I saw him mainly, but I also saw his wife a couple of times, Adina. I'll just read this just on. I'd seen Chaim for 7 sessions. A few of them included his wife Adina. I'd engaged well with them. He always attended the appointments. He indicated that he felt the work we were doing together was useful. We had a relationship which was serious but sort of playful, tongue-in-cheek at times. At the beginning of the 8th session, he came in and he sat down and I asked him how he'd been and how his wife was, and he said he hadn't been too well and his wife was ill in bed. One of the themes that had come up in the therapy was that Adina had said that she didn't feel cared for enough. So I decided I'd take a risk. I asked him, "Are you cooking for your wife?" And he looked at me as if I was from another planet. "No," he said, "it's not in me." "It's not in you?" "Yeah, it's not in me." "It's not in you genetically?" I asked. He grinned and said, "No." "It's not in you religiously?" "No." So I reminded him of this, the equation for change that I'd shown him in an earlier session. And he remembered it, and I said, "Okay, let me suggest something. You remember that when we first started and I showed you this diagram, and you said yes. So can I make a suggestion," I said, "that you experiment with some difference by cooking for your wife while she is ill?" He wasn't quite sure, but I pursued it. He probably felt a bit cornered, probably an understatement, but he went along with it. So I said, "What will you cook?" He thought about it and he said, "Spaghetti meatballs." He'd come with a health issue and I didn't think that was probably the most healthy thing for him, but I restrained myself. "Fine," I said, "but let me push you a bit further." And at this point I was really enjoying the interaction. I said, "How about making your own sauce?" I have no idea why I said that. I was just pushing a bit. Anyway, and he smiled and said, "Okay." And I'm sure at that point he was really wanting to go, but he was patient with me. And I said, "Okay." Anyway, we went on with the session. 2 weeks later he returned. "How do you get on with the cooking?" I asked. And he said, "My wife got better." But then he quickly added, "But we did it together. And you know," and his voice rose in wonderment, he said, "It was really harmonious." It was a lovely moment. I'll never forget his voice. But it was a revelation to this man. And so I felt that sort of what I'd done in helping him, he had a very fixed view of how things should be, but I was sort of taking risks through asking him to experiment with difference. Now the thing about experimenting with difference is, first of all you have to have a commitment. But sometimes people just have a commitment in their head and they don't do anything. So you have to have action. And then for change to be considered change, there has to be repetition over time. Now, one thing I don't do is, I'd like you to experiment with change. Because change is often too big for people. So people come wanting things to be different, but often they want other people to be different, not themselves. When I reflected on this piece of work, I thought, well, probably some years ago I wouldn't have done that, because I would have said to myself, well, this is his culture, this is his religion, as if culture is static, and of course it isn't. Culture is always evolving, and even within a very tight-knit community like the ultra-Orthodox community in Stonians and Stamford Hill, there are differences. So there are windows for sort of opportunity. Okay. The third thing is, as part of safe uncertainty, is an increasing ability to take relational risks. Now, there are individual risks. We can drive a car fast, we can bet on a horse or whatever, climb a mountain. They may have relational implications, but they essentially are individual risks. The relational risk-taking, which is what we're involved with, is the taking of emotional initiatives. And I remember a few years ago now, when I first thought of this, I remember going to John in a state of exuberance and saying, John, I think I found the Holy Grail. I think I've found it. I was joking, but then I thought afterwards, I think I'm serious. To quote Donald Trump, sad. I never thought I'd quote Donald Trump. Take that back. Take that. Don't record it. Anyway, there often, as John, people would be not expressing their dissatisfaction. All of us have been in this place, haven't we, where we're having more of a conversation inside our own head than actually having a conversation with people that the conversation in our head is about. Everybody surely in this room has had those kinds of situations. I mean, a few weeks ago there was an issue between my wife and I thought, I need to take the risk here. And then I said to myself, nah. Tomorrow. And, my God, you can't be perfect, can you? So, if you took relational risks all the time, you'd lower your life expectancy. Anyway, but I do believe that a lot of the time that when people come for help, they've come in a state of disconnected intimacy. That they might have been able to talk at one time perhaps, but now there's a disconnection of the intimacy. And I find a lot of the time it's like, how can I help people take risks to move into safe uncertainty and take that chance? And I think a lot of the time now, I think that's what I'm doing. And, it's also important, of course, that in helping people to take relational risks, we become better at taking relational risks. So here's an example of me. It's a piece of work. It's a first session with a couple where the woman has been in chronic pain for about 20 years. They're both age 65. I thought it'd be interesting to sort of include older people in this presentation. And they're both 65. She'd been to a pain management clinic. They were aware of some of the work that I did. So the consultant referred to me, and I spoke to the woman on the phone about an appointment, and I also said, well, when people have a chronic illness, other people in the family, are affected. And so she'd mentioned her husband. I said, well, do you think your husband would like to come? Would you be okay with that? And she said she's fine. And she handed me over to her husband, and I invited him. He was a bit sort of reluctant, but he said he would come. I think the other thing I should say at this point is that I don't say people are resistant. We tend to not go there. If people are reluctant, there's usually a logic to their reluctance. And part of my task is to engage with them, to understand and explore the logic of their reluctance. To say you are resistant is getting into that overuse of the verb to be again. So, I'm working with this couple in the first session. She'd also had a triple heart. God, she'd also had a triple heart bypass, and he said when he was there, he said, "I've come for my wife," and she felt that it was difficult. She said to talk about her concerns about her illness. She felt she was a burden to him. She did indicate, however, that he was very caring in terms of doing things about the house for her, shopping, practical things. After about half an hour, I sensed that there was an elephant in the room, and that he was worried that she would die. I was unsure whether to raise this because it was the first session. He seemed a bit reluctant. Would I lose him? And for about 10 minutes, I had a conversation in my head. Should I take the risk? And then I was talking with them at the same time. And in the end, I decided to take the risk. But I was very anxious. And you can see, and I may well blush at this point, that you can see my anxiety in action with the first question. Do you have a concern that your wife is going to have another heart attack, stop breathing, drop dead? It was sort of over the top, really. Anyway, he says it's on my mind all the time. Is that something you keep to yourself? Yes. And then favourite question of mine, what's it like me asking you that question? So the act relates also to what he then started to go on to. He says, to ask it and to answer it is a relief. You've asked it and I've answered it, and I do find a relief from answering it. You know, the act of speaking is the act of hearing yourself speak. So you have a relationship with what you hear yourself say. And this is what he was doing there. Tell me in what way it's a relief. To hear myself say it out loud, and for my wife to hear it, it's always on my mind. What prevented you from saying it before? Oh, I don't know, you keep it to yourself. If you say it to someone else, you're giving it to someone else, and I'll just come back to that. Can I have 5 more minutes? And then I turned to her and I said, what's it been like for you hearing your husband say it's a relief to say these things? It makes a big difference. And then she said somewhat sadly, I didn't know he cared. And I'm going to go on now to a slightly different piece of work, a different piece of work. I think the thing is with this piece of work, I think my willingness to take a relational risk had contributed to the man opening up and moving from being a reluctant client to one that became fully engaged. He seemed able to take a relational risk. And in fact, they came for 7 sessions. And the issue about him saying, oh, what did he say? Oh, I don't know, you keep it to yourself. If you say it to someone else, you're giving it to someone else. It was like an infection. And it seemed to me that was a statement about his beliefs about how you cope with adversity. So then I started to use a question that had come up in my doctoral research, which was I was asking people the following question, which I now use with everyone, because it relates to people come to see us, they're always dealing with adversity. And I say this, you know, when we're growing up in our families, communities, etc., we often pick up messages about how to cope with difficult times in life. When you were growing up, what messages did you pick up about how to cope with difficult times in life? And it's been amazing. I've been saying for a year I've nearly finished this article, but I will. It was amazing, the response, because what he said was that when he was growing up in his community, working class community, when he was 4, his brother died in a fire. When he was 5, his father died, and when he was a teenager, his sister was murdered. And he grew up with the idea that, you know, things happen. You can't do anything. These things happen. There's no use going on about them. She came from, and it may be a gendered script, but not automatically so. She came from a family where they talked about things. So when she was worried about her health, she would talk to him, but sometimes he would say things not very helpfully, not that bloody pain again. Anyway, what these scripts, family of origin, cultural scripts in coping with adversity came out. And it was the first time. They'd been married for over 40 years, and it was new to them hearing this. And there was a big change. Worked on things with them for 7 sessions. And things improved, and they started talking with each other. The fact is that she said, "Oh, I didn't know he cared." When at the end of the final session, I turned to them and said, "What's come up in the sessions that have particularly, affected you?" And he said, in language of another era, he said, "I've learned one thing," he said. The women, they like you to talk. It's something, a revelation, isn't it? It's, anyway, so I'm just going to quickly run through this other case where the last few minutes. Okay, so this is a family of 4, Joan, David, Elaine, 15, Tom, 12. Well, he doesn't say anything in this session. She had a chronic pain condition, and their daughter also had a chronic pain condition. In the early part of the session, this is the first session, the mother talks about the fact that when she was growing up, she looked after her mother, and keeping things together was quite important for her. And then I come in at one point and say, keeping things together seems to be very important to you because of things that happened in your family when you were growing up, is that right? Yes, she says, it's just coping day to day, because some days I feel I can't cope physically or emotionally. I just feel I'll blow. What would that mean, I said, when you think of the worst case scenario and you think about things blowing? What do you see actually happening? And what do you think is the effect on the others in your family of saying that? Do they know that? Have you said that to them? How to interview poorly. Father said, she said it before, no, I've just said I can't cope, I'm going to explode. It's like I'm winding with the coping. I've been able to keep it at bay because I've been looking at the future, thinking I will get better and something could be done. But now it's the not knowing. It's how much longer can I keep going? How much longer can I sustain going on as we are? What's your guess, I say? How much longer can you go on? So I'm starting to take a relational risk, to encourage relational risk-taking. I try to put it to the back of my mind. I sense the way you talk about it is that it's a great worry for you. Yes. Do you think they, the family, know that? They realise, but I do say I've had enough. So when you say I've had enough, what do you think they understand by that? They know it's because of the pain. So what do they think? Father comes in. I think I know what she means, but I don't want to say. Okay, I'm not going to push you, but what would your concern be about saying? Well, he says, not with the kids here, but I know what she means. So I take a risk and I turn to the children. What do you think when your mum says what she said? Why do you think your dad said, I'm not going to say? And she says, I think sometimes she wants to end her life. How long have you felt that? Since I was 10. The mother then comes in. Oh my God, that long ago? Yes, when I had to call for an ambulance for you. And then I turned to Elaine. I get the sense that when he said that, it was quite hard for you to say. You've never said that to your mum before? No. That's pretty brave. She says what she feels, Elaine, says Father, but she keeps things back if she feels she's going to upset someone. me to Elaine, what did it feel like to have said that? Brilliant. So I sort of did some work with the family, and the daughter, we finished the work, but the daughter wrote to me a couple of times and talked about her development. It was very sweet. And I'm sort of aware of the time and need to finish, but there are I won't go into them, but the other issues are what I'm looking for in terms of safe uncertainty, whether people are in that, the openness to being challenged, and an ability to deal with tension collaboratively. Tension in itself is not a negative thing. We all have tension in relationships. It's how we deal with that tension that's important. I just want to say, finish by saying something about the disposition of the clinician. The way I think about it is a both-and position. I got rather disillusioned with the idea that a purist interpretation of the not knowing position, that therefore we couldn't come in with ideas that we have. So I wrote in the Safe Uncertainty paper actually a stance which was a position of authoritative doubt. A position of authoritative doubt, which is the ownership of expertise in the context of uncertainty. So, it's, you're trying to find a sort of both-and position, which gives you permission to come in with ideas that may or may not be helpful. I don't want, for example, if I was being seen as a client, I do not want someone to just ask me questions. Most of the time I ask questions, but I come in with some of my views at times. And same with supervision. I don't want a supervisor who will just ask me questions. I want to hear what they think. What ideas have they got? So it's a both-and. So hopefully those give you some ideas about actually what makes up safe uncertainty, those 6 areas. And thank you very much. Thank you.